Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this evening's program, a conversation between professors Olivette Otele and Martha Jones about Otele's recent book, African Europeans, An Untold History. My name is Marcia Eli. I'm the Director of Programs at the Center for Brooklyn History, and I am very excited for the discussion we're about to hear between these two incredibly distinguished historians. First, a word about CBH. The Center for Brooklyn History is a proud part of the Brooklyn Public Library. We hold the world's most extensive collection of Brooklyn-related materials. We bring education programs to classrooms across the city. Soon we'll be presenting exhibitions again, and every single week we offer free programs like this one through the library's programming arm, which is called BPL Presents. BPL Presents curates concerts and family programs and book talks and much more. Just as an example, next week, for instance, we'll be talking about growing up Jewish in Brooklyn with Roz Chast, cartoonist Roz Chast, and designer Isaac Mizrahi. Later in May, we'll welcome Sarah Horowitz, the MacArthur genius and founder of the Freelancers Union, for a discussion about her theory of mutualism. And then in June, we have a program that looks at the facts and the cover-up of the Tulsa Race Massacre in connection with the 100th anniversary of that horrific event. So I hope you will visit the Brooklyn Public Library's website and find BPL Presents and explore what's coming up and join us again. So I won't speak for very long because we really want to get right to this, but I do have two additional quick notes. First, if you want to purchase Professor Otele's book, and I really hope that you do, we will be putting a link in the chat to the book page at the community bookstore in Park Slope in support of local Brooklyn businesses. And second, I want to invite all of you to share your questions. Just type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my great honor, really, to introduce tonight's conversationalists. Olivette Otele is professor of the history of slavery at the University of Bristol and vice president of the Royal Historical Society. She is the first Black woman to be appointed to a professorial chair in history in the UK, and her writing has appeared in The Guardian, BBC Extra, and the Times Higher Education. I could go on, but we'll stop there. Same thing with Professor Martha S. Jones. She is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Her most recent book, and again, I'm really abbreviating these introductions so we can get right to the talk, is Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, and it was selected as one of Time's 100 must-read books for 2020. So thanks to both of you for being here. I am going to hand it over to you and disappear. So thank you, it's a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Marcia, and thank you to the Center for Brooklyn History. I still remember you as the Brooklyn Historical Society, but that tells you just how old I am. But we are thrilled to be here in any case, and I want to welcome you, Professor Otele, to Brooklyn, and congratulations on today. It is an auspicious one. Publication day in the US of this not only beautiful, but profoundly ambitious and important book. What a gift this is to us. And I'm really honored to be the person to help you celebrate today the arrival of this book in the US. So welcome again to Brooklyn and to wherever folks are beaming in from.
Thank you ever so much for having me. I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you.
You and I are going to have an opportunity to talk for about 40 minutes. And I've got lots of questions. But feel free to chime in if there are things you want to be sure we talk about. And then we'll have a chance to turn to questions and answers from folks who have tuned in this evening. So yes, please use the Q&A function and the questions will find their way to me, and I'll be very happy to pose them to Professor Otele before we close out at the end of the half hour. So let me dive in.
Okay.
You know, I think in some ways, I'm probably not the only reader who encounters this book and its title, African Europeans, and at first blush thinks she knows where you're going or where you're coming from. And then you open this book and it is not the story of, I don't know, it's not the story of the Atlantic slave trade alone. It is not the story of the Windrush generation. It is not the story of contemporary debates about immigration. It turns out to be a story that takes 2 millennia to unfold, in fact. And I thought we might start there. And because I think that when you take us back to, you know, the ancient Roman Empire, I realized this is a very different history than the one I certainly had learned in school. So why 2 millennia, and how did you get to that ambitious framing?
Oh, thank you. Actually, it started out as me growing up in Paris and being taught at a very young age that the birth of civilization was ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And me not recognizing myself or finding myself or people of African descent in that story I was told. And yet I knew from family members that there was a bigger story about that, because it was a story between Egyptians, the Marriott queens, and the story that was actually told by my grandmother. She didn't go to university, but it was a story that was transmitted to her in terms of, and it was a story about how Africans and Europeans were constantly dialoguing throughout centuries, and that story went back to ancient Egypt. In fact, she was supposed to become a sister, and she was very much very religious, and she kept talking about the Bible and stories from the Bible, and there was no barriers for her between continents. It was about community. It was about various trajectories, and I wanted to go back to that. As I said, as a child, I would just find it appalling that some of the stories were not taught to me. And as a teenager, I dug a bit more and then found out about Rome. So when I joined university, I was always provoking my teachers about not teaching that story and being more or less dismissed, really. So I thought, well, I'm going to write about this one day.
It's really important to say, isn't it, that historians don't always choose their topics by reaching for a book, you know, a scholarly book on the library shelf, right? But that importantly, we reach for the stories that animate our lives, that animate our families, and this vision, right, of you holding on to that story from your grandmother and then asking it and then telling it in this way, I think is really, that's very strong for me. I also want to ask about space. I'm laying the foundation here, but I think geography is important because once again, I think I opened this book and I thought, well, I roughly know the parameters of Europe, even as they have they shift and get tinkered with around the edges. I think I know Brexit being, I guess, a good example of how those things are shifting, but I roughly have a notion of Europe. And similarly with Africa on a 21st century map, I think I would know how to delineate those things. But you are offering us a different kind of geography. It includes the geographies of empire, the Roman Empire to the British Empire, the French Empire, and beyond. And I think I came away with the sense that in this book, yes, these are geographies, but in a sense, these are also ideas. So what is Africa and what is Europe in this book? Because I think it's not simply what is reflected on the map, the tourist map that I'm familiar with.
Absolutely, because when we talk about trajectories, we talk about the construction of boundaries, ideological boundaries, but also geographic. And indeed, the construction of Africa versus Europe was construction that was done in contrast, in opposition. And I really wanted to look at that as well, because Roman Empire wasn't about Europe. The Roman Empire was about conquests and territories from Egypt, Asia, to Britannia, really, to York, where Septimius Severus, the Roman emperor, died. So it's much broader in terms of ideology and mindset than we know today. So we have a kind of reduction of what it was historically. North Africa, part of North Africa, at least what is nowadays Libya, belonged to the Roman Empire. And by extension, the subject were Roman subject. And so I really wanted to expand on that and challenge our assumption about those called migrants, illegal migrants. What does it mean? 21st century have put those boundaries when actually they were not illegal at all. It was completely different. And it was still about subjugation. Roman Empire wasn't lovey-dovey, but it was still about subjugation. So there are resonances with 21st century, but yet the boundaries were completely different. And I wanted to challenge, or not challenge really, but to kind of invite people to rethink how those boundaries were put across time and space.
You left me thinking about ideas about space, North Africa and the Maghreb, the Mediterranean, right? That is so animated European history for a long time. The Middle East, I realize, I think, what relatively recent constructions those are, right? Relative to this long history that you tell. And still, there's a kind of continuity, and it is, at least in among US historians, it's become a bit of a chicken or the egg question, right? How is Blackness, Africanness come to be constructed over time? We've had very recently historian Ibram Kendi in his book Stamped from the Beginning has tried to map out the history of anti-Black racism, but that's an old project. Winthrop Jordan did that 2 generations ago. But I've also read European historians who I think tell a different story about the Iberian Peninsula and Jews, conversos, who are also said to have been racialized. I was trying to plot out your story, and I think it goes from otherness to racialization to racism, maybe to Afrophobia by the end. Am I getting that right? And is that the
Yes.
you wanted to draw here? Because I think importantly, it's no longer a chicken or the egg question, but there is still an open question about how we get from otherness to Afrophobia, as you put it.
Yes, absolutely. For me, there's an evolution, there's a progression, not in a positive sense, but there's changes across time, and not just a tightening of the definition of otherness, but a redefining of otherness and a reduction of what it could be. Otherness could be anything. But when you limit otherness to Blackness, and then perhaps in the French context or in other contexts, you limit Black Muslimness, you reduce it more and more so that it becomes comfortable for a certain number of people to actually pinpoint or to actually, to subjugate or to discriminate. But actually, there's comfort in that reduction for various reasons. And for me, it was interesting to look at the fact that 13th century, for example, otherness could be the Irish already. Otherness was the Irish. Otherness was what was later called the Saracen, the Muslim ones. Otherness was also the one that we couldn't see across the Mediterranean. So, for example, sub-Saharan Africa was not imagined, and therefore it was otherness as well. So there are categories of racialization there that were not necessarily based on skin color. They were religious, they were, melanin, they were all sorts, and they were indeed more and more focused as time went by on economic success and on conquest. So by the time we reach the 15th century, the Venetians have already done that. They've already put those ground rules in terms of importing enslaved people, with selling slaves from enslaved people from Eastern Europe. So otherness was also right, by the way. So we're selling them to the Egyptian or to the Ottoman Empire, what was later known as the Ottoman Empire. So otherness had so many delimitations, but because of the economic conquest and enslavement, otherness became the enslaved. And as time went by, the enslaved became the one with a darker skin tone. And therefore, we're completely reducing what it is and what it was. But again, I tend to, look at longer histories because that's what I'm fascinated by. And I tend to think that this is just the history of the last 20 centuries. Before that, there was another history that is equally incredibly important and completely different. So our understanding of the world is only reductive and based on the last 3 centuries. And it's such a shame, really.
So if I say to you that I follow your story, but I think of transatlantic slavery, here we are in the 16th century, the Portuguese, the Spanish, etc., now trading in sub-Saharan Africans to the Americas. What does it have to do with Europe? Which is to say, in terms of the geography, right? How does that? I might say that's a Caribbean story. That's a story about the New World. That's a story about the Americas. Yes, I understand the role of Europeans there, but I don't really understand how it figures in Europe.
It's a completely it's a completely European story, because the very decision to go and roam the oceans and go across the seas and all that was started with European battles and European imperatives and European desire to outdo each other, war of succession, and the quest for gold. And instead of gold, they find other things, that they find human beings, really, that they could trade and use as commodities and productive tools and so on. So it's a very much European story, because this is when Europe actually start defining itself as this global, this kind of define itself, I have to say this, define itself as this unique entity. Before that, it was just kingdom fighting against each other, but by fighting against each other, they were also coming to kind of, it wasn't a compromise, but it defined them as a group of people who went across the ocean to conquer the world. And therefore, it became that thing ideologically, Europe became, because of that trajectory. And by becoming, they started defining others through that prism of conquest. So it's a very much for me European story, but it's also obviously an African story, an American story, and definitely an Asian story because of these various institutions put in place to reach those goals.
You're very generous in this book, in that you help people like me by, in part, charting out not only what's been remembered of this history, but how much forgetting there has been of this history. And so I often get the question, especially from young people, why didn't I learn this in school? And I wonder how you would answer that question for young readers. Why didn't I learn this in school, Professor? Why do I have to come to, wonderfully to Brooklyn and to Zoom in order to encounter this history? How did it get forgotten?
Okay, so what happens to me, and that's also the trajectory of this book, it's the question of erasure. The construction of erasure and the construction of national narrative and European narratives. So it's built on erasure, it's built on hierarchization of stories. Therefore, Europe presents itself as the victor of colonial conquest and decided to create a narrative that is cohesive and coherent for its populations. And it's done that by excluding others. And therefore, those narratives that I deem important, for example, as an African European, are not in there. It's not just a question of minority versus majority. It's a question of who gets to tell that story and how they want to present it to the rest of the world. And because we're all standing on the shoulders of our forefathers, we are also standing on the shoulders of that erasure, and we've been taught those stories as they are today. So yeah, we're very much a product of our past, all of us.
And I know that you're very importantly involved in the work of restoring this memory, not only in this book. I'm thinking about your work on the scientific committee that advises France's Foundation for the Remembrance of Slavery. I think US readers might be surprised to learn that France has not only declared slavery to have been a crime against humanity, but that for many, many years now, France has held an annual commemoration, a memorialization to the enslaved people and those captured in the trade. And this new foundation is doing the work of education, memorialization, and even, I think, some reconciliation. So here, I think there's a deliberateness, right? And a sort of work on many kinds of fronts, right? In order to restore the memory. It can't only be in the books, it seems like in your work. What are your goals for this work of the foundation? And how do you see that playing a role in restoring the memory?
Oh, it's a fantastic, fantastic initiative and fantastic idea. And it was born out of, in 2001, France decided to, declare slavery as a crime against humanity, but it wasn't just a text, it wasn't just, a debate. It was about a reworking on the school curriculum and starting to teach that history systematically at all levels, of course, taking into account, age groups and all the rest of it. So it's not a history by now that is unknown. And the next step was to commemorate and to remember and to give thanks to those who unwillingly gave their lives for France to be the republic it is today, and to go further to recognize all aspects of that past. So the work of the foundation is to keep that alive, but also to look at details. For example, with Professor Jean Ebrard, we're working at the moment on ways in which language has shaped the way we learn. So in France, there are words that you can't use and words in the US that you can use and so on and so forth. So it actually has put a kind of hierarchy in terms of stories, but also it has put people in places in places where they can't express certain things. Race, for example, in France normally doesn't exist because it's supposed to be biologically, it doesn't exist, but it does exist in terms of a social construct, ideological construct. So France has a hard time reconciling its ideals with what actually is happening at in people's daily experiences and so on and so forth. So it's a work that is very detailed and very sophisticated, and I'm so indebted to so many people working on that foundation, because it's not easy. It's even us historians, sociologists, and so on and so forth, it's challenging our own assumption in our own education. And I hope that it's going to bear fruits in the long run.
You know, you're reminding me of the very first time we met. And I think it was at a conference in the UK where, in sort of as a sidebar to the formal proceedings, we wound up in a very spirited, I'll put it that way, a very spirited conversation about language, about what today in the US is termed the N-word. Does France have an N-word? And I wonder, though, if language was something you had to think about as you wrote this book, right? Because this is a book that is very true to the archival materials, and the way in which language and the uses of terms has evolved over time is important and remarkable. And this is a book for a broad readership, not only for specialists who might come to troubling language with a context or an understanding of why it's necessary to include troubling language. But did you wrestle with words and language and how to speak to people without, I guess, being overly provocative or overly injurious even in your language? I don't think that's easy when you're writing about millennia, if I could say it that way.
It's incredibly difficult because of the different cultures and the different historical legacies of that language. For example, it's easy in a way in English because you have several steps, and 18th century N-word is different from 21st century. It's easy in a way. But for example, if you were to, and this is what's happening, my book's being translated and having conversation with the translator, that word can't be used in 21st century. And yet, because for 21st century, it's derogatory, it's painful. So bluntly translating it doesn't work. And yet there are purists who think that you should do that because this is just the way it is. But behind that, behind that language and behind that words, that there's a whole history of racism that's being played out very subtly and hiding behind the lexicon. So we need to unpack that, and it's incredibly, incredibly difficult and quite painful, I have to say. It still remain painful at times. So we'll see how it goes, really.
Yeah, well, I think that, for us, this is a really alive debate, right? And I don't think we have an answer, but I think as we work, as you and I both do, right, on Black subjects, we are very much on the front lines. And I know my students are tuning in and very attuned to my language, the language of their peers. So I hope this is a book that creates some space for thinking about those questions in an embedded way and in a historical way. Also among my students are young people who understand themselves to have been the inventors of a notion that is commonly referred to as a mixed race identity. They no longer see the world, certainly in black and white terms, and they no longer see those as mutually exclusive categories. If I'm someone who was born long ago enough that I was taught the so-called one-drop rule about race in the United States, my students don't buy that. You offer us an important challenge to a kind of black-white binary view of this world of Europe and Africa. And you use a term that was new to me, but I thought very useful, dual heritage. So can you talk a bit about the role that the idea of dual heritage plays in this book, and the role that people of dual heritage play in the construction of the African European? It turned out to be much more important than I imagined.
It is indeed very important for me at so many levels, because it's easier in a way to think Europe, Africa, color. And it doesn't work that way. We know it doesn't work that way. And we also know that the term mixed race, send us back to the idea of race and the idea and the whole historical legacy of the question of race and racialization and so on and so forth. So there are still people who resist. I mean, in 21st century Britain, there are people who resist that, particularly from my students, my young students resist that. They would use dual heritage because when society in Britain, simply because it's beyond the color. It's really cultural differences that you can have in one family, in one household, where you have two completely different cultures, or cultures that seem similar, but because of the racial experiences and the racialization, and because of the kind of experience of prejudice, it becomes culturally, it has completely shaped their culture in a way. Caribbean communities, for example, people of Caribbean descent are different from people of African descent. So dual heritage becomes a very, very important term, and a space for freedom to reinterpret identity. You are who you say you are, not necessarily what people say you are. So if it's a space for claiming identities, and I find it very useful, and not just useful, very liberating in so many ways, and respectful in a way.
One of the things you do so beautifully in this book is give us real, living, breathing people from the past. This might have been a book that was written in a wholly synthetic way with your unique sort of narrator's voice, but you give us chapter after chapter, character after character. I want to ask you about one of them. There are so many, but I want to ask about a man, I think it's Theodore Michael or Michel. So we're in the 20th century, and I think I've got this right, that there emerges an indigenous elite in Cameroon. He is a child of this elite in a moment that is going to span sort of the colonial and then the post-colonial period. He's raised and educated in Germany and then France, and you term him an Afro-German. And I started to take notes on this point, because before you're done with this chapter, you're talking to us now about, no longer about simply race at all, notions of home, of citizenship, of belonging, of migration. And we're introduced to, yes, Afro-Germans, but Afro-Greeks and Afro-Spaniards, Afro-Russians, Afro-Poles, Afro-Swedes, Afro-Italians. Forgive me, I started to make a list because I think there is few among us, right, who wouldn't learn something about really the depth, the reach, and the centrality of this notion of Afro-Europeans to everywhere across Europe. So you give us the hyphenated European. And is that the story in part of the 20th century, this hyphenated European?
Absolutely, it is the story. I started earlier, and I wanted really to take readers on a journey, because so that they can understand what it means to be European today. It's not just one definition. encompasses all these identities. The Afro-German you're talking about is somebody who has very little connection with Africa in a sense, because it's children born in Europe, it's children born from families who see themselves already as African and Europeans already. It's about class as well, because we envisage those populations as migrants, poor migrants coming for better lives. These are stories that I tell, but his story is not that story. His story is the story of somebody who saw himself as, equal to the elite in the sense, and he doesn't understand why he should be ostracized, because he really belongs to that category of people. And he's arrogant about it, because after all, why wouldn't he be? He belongs to wherever he says he belongs to, even if it's not the accepted position because of the color, because of the dual heritage and all the rest of it. And the rest of Europe just function in different layers, function like that. Younger generations claim that space unreservedly. They say they are who they are, and they want to be considered and seen that way. And some of them are fighting for that identity to be accepted, but a lot of them don't. They just don't care. They're going to live their lives as they see fit, navigating those different identities. So if I say Afro-German, very different from Afro-Greeks, because they claim their German identity, and the others are claiming their Greek identity. And they would even challenge the notion of being European at certain times. They would be German first, African as well, and then European. And so, but it depends on the context, wherever they are, because once they go to Africa, they have a different mindset, and they present themselves differently as well. And I'm talking from experience, I have German family.
Well, you've opened the door to my next question, so I appreciate that. I just want to remind folks, in a couple minutes, I'll turn to questions from the audience, and so by all means, please drop your questions in the Q&A function. So I wasn't sure if I was going to ask you this question about yourself, but now twice I think you've shown your cards enough that I can put it this way. Why were you the historian to write this book? Someone of African origins, a life in France, now living in Wales, if I'm not mistaken, if I understand your media flow, and teaching in England. And this is a book published in the UK, now in the US. I hear translations in the works. So what does it mean for you to be an African European, if in fact that is a moniker you would accept? And how does that, I think maybe what I really want to understand is how your experience, your identity, positioned you to undertake this particular book.
Yes, it's a very, in a way, my family history is not really completely transparent in this book, and yet it completely guided me. I come from a background where German colonization of Cameroon. I was born in Cameroon. It's easy to say you had the German on one side and the Cameroon on the other, but great-grandmother was forcibly involved with the Germans. So again, sexual violence and all the rest of it reduced us as a family. And therefore, I have cousins in Germany. And therefore, we have German identity that I won't claim because I feel more French than German, actually, but never mind that. And then trajectory, traveling to France, again, family embedded in France, mixity of identity, voluntary this time, and then a personal story of mother being involved with Caribbean Welsh person. So it's a very mixed family. So what I want to say is there's I claim Blackness, I claim Africanness, but I also claim the others. And why wouldn't I? And this book was really about it. I have children who who see themselves as Cameroonian, Welsh, French, and European. So, you know, and they have no problem with navigating those different identities. And I think this is really a message of hope. It's not to do with the fact that the proximity to whiteness, or, you know, as I keep hearing, and there's that as well in certain cases, but it's about accepting that there are things that you're not responsible for. You're certainly not responsible from who you're born from. But why not just take it and run with it?
So if I said to you, you know, part of what I think I see at the same time is, yes, that story about oneself and identity, but I actually think I see more, not only through your example of the way in which, if you will, an African European perspective is changing the way we're thinking about many things. History, yes, and your book is the model for that. But just today, I think, for example, Georgetown University announced that someone whom you mentioned late in the book, the journalist and filmmaker and intellectual Rokhaya Diallo, is coming to be in residence at Georgetown University. And so, yeah, I'm thrilled because I live just up the street in Baltimore. But I want you to say a little bit more about what's going on, because I think that it is more than self-actualization. It is really the presence of folks and ways of thinking and seeing the world that are challenging the way we see the world.
Absolutely. Rokhaya is somebody who's a force of nature. She's been battling against the kind of conservative France that sees itself as mainly white. And she's incredible, because I would crumble under such amounts of attacks, but she always very quietly, very calmly, and very, very eloquently explain things, how France has been dealing, or not dealing actually, with racism. And I think that, you know, her traveling to the US is an extraordinary moment, because I hope that this is going to be a moment of reckoning for France, to understand that France unwillingly is exporting some of her children of the Republic, as France doesn't see them, are actually contributing to the world intellectual journey. And this is how I see it. And I see it as an incredible moment. They will be forced to reckon that African Europeans come in many shapes and forms, and therefore France is not just this old kind of conservative country. There's much more going on, and that much more going on is not actually visible in the media, and it's not the way it's presented. It's not what you see on telly, is not necessarily the France that I know and that Rokhaya is and present.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've also been reading Rokhaya in the Washington Post for a while now, but I, for one, really am looking forward to what she brings, as like you, to our conversations. And that's the next question, one that's coming from our audience, which is about how the ideas in this book, the history that you tell, these 2 millennia, might influence our thinking about race and racism in the US. It's not lost on you. You tell us in this book, you must be putting the last finishing touches on this book in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota, the wave of protests that are not at all confined to the US, but in fact also erupt in European cities. I feel you in the book trying to gesture at that connection, but I wonder, you've had a few months, you know, and only more has unfolded, including the conviction of the former police officer who killed Mr. Floyd. What do you hope, or do you hope that there is
yes,
a role that this book plays in our contemporary struggles, yes, in Europe, but even in the US around the problem of anti-Black.
Yes, I was trying to really, my huge hope was for the US to see that, this is not a US story only. It is and it isn't. It's not an exceptional story, and it is. It's the ordinary stories of people who have been subjugated, who have been discriminated against. And that story plays out slightly differently, but still plays out more or less the same, with the same processes that we see in the rest of Europe. And people might not measure how much people of African descent, the Black population in the rest of Europe, was shocked. Just watching that video triggered so many of us. People would never measure this. And it was a moment of mourning. It was a moment of rage, because some of these communities, people of African descent, Black people, dual heritage people, have been fighting in Europe for centuries, just as the Americans. And America, US have shown us that there was a way, and that way was through intercultural collaborations, through a relentless struggle. As your book shows, these are the examples some of us have been following and trying to emulate, because it's about organizing ourselves, fundraising, organizing the ballot, and all these struggles have bear fruit in the US. So seeing some of the results being disrespected was just so difficult. I can't even talk about it. It was so difficult for us. But at the same time, it gave us that fire to continue. And it's just a hope. Rakai coming to the US and many others, it's just a hope that, people on the other side of the pond will understand that we're keys, This is a story of siblings trying to reach out to one another. This is it.
I love that metaphor, and I can say for myself, I think the book really does succeed in dispelling, our old ideas about the distance, right, between the US and Europe, especially on questions of race and racism, but also dispelling what I understand to be, chatter among European intellectuals about, how somehow to speak about or to study or to struggle over the problem of race and racism in Europe is to somehow have been tainted by US ideas, as if those things were invented solely in the Americas and aren't a part of Europe. And that contribution, I think, is undeniable in this book, that you knit us together in this really, really important way. So I've got lots of questions. So let me, folks want us to dive in a little bit. So let me ask you an important question about the types of sources that you use in this book. One of the things that was so striking to me, and folks are remarking on the cover, I think they'd love it if you'd comment on this image if you could, but more broadly, what was remarkable to me was that your sources included things like art, painting, literature. So how do you, I don't know how you master those sources, that in and of itself, but how do you decide what sorts of sources to use for any given period in order to tell this story?
I suppose this is coming from my French education. The education, I don't know how it works in the US. I know that in France, you're supposed to, by the time you reach the baccalaureate, to have this really broad idea of what art is, have this conversation about art house. So these sources are not things that I didn't know about in terms of art, representation of Black bodies in European art and in French art, Géricault and many others, is so common. It was something that school children and teenagers are taught more or less. But I wanted to dig deeper and kind of see what it meant for us, for me, and for other people, how we see these people. Painting looks glamorous, but the reality was very, very different. The person on the cover is an anonymous subject. Even that is extraordinary for me. So I wanted to play with, yes, with the exceptional that we know, the characters that we know, and the not so exceptional, the ordinary, but who have been represented and not given a name, because those are the ones who are the majority, and yet they built Europe in so many ways, as much as other people. So the sources were varied. A lot of the research has been done very by certain academics, for example, 15th century Florence or things like that. So I use those researches, but I also look at archival material. For Cameroon, I look at certain archival material. In other places, I didn't use the sources I had because for various reasons, sometimes it was hard for me. When I looked at the boxer battling Siki, well, for example, it was hard to use sources because we don't have his voices. He was world champion in 1922, and yet we don't really have his voice. He didn't leave anything because, well, for many reasons, he wasn't seen as an intellectual, as somebody worthy enough to be given space to talk in a book. So I'm giving him his space, and he's there, and I love him very much. But I don't have sources as in, material. So I wanted to try to do that throughout the book, really.
Yeah. So people, I think, in the questions are trying to think through the scope questions that we started with at the beginning, particularly the one about space. How much do you think we need to think about Africa and the continent, and notions of otherness on the continent might be a way of putting the question. Another way might be, is this part of a global history, right? Is this, do you see this linked to world history? And you've given us a piece of it.
Yes, it is world history. It's European history. It's also African history. And as I said, I wanted to travel boundaries. I talk about dual heritage in Europe, but I also talk about, I mention enslaved people from Eastern Europe becoming Mamluks in Egypt. And therefore they were European Africans and Muslims. Mm-hmm. And I also talk about Ga women in Ghana, nowadays Ghana, who were dual heritage, but who were very much embedded in their African culture and claiming that space. So it's important to understand that there are certain boundaries that we were taught are boundaries, but they weren't necessarily like that. And we need to, when you think about Africa, 21st century Africa, people have all sorts of ideas, but it's much more than that. And our understanding in the global north of what Africa is completely different from what it is for Africans, nowadays Africans, and just, give ourselves the freedom to expand and to accept that there are many interpretations of what one space can be.
Yeah, I think that's why for me, your starting place, helping us think about the Roman Empire, and then your reminder to us, right, about the scope and the scale of the Roman Empire, which defies any sort of simple or contemporary notions of those boundaries, is incredibly, incredibly helpful. I've got a couple more, and we've got a few minutes, so let me try and burrow in here. Well, one of the questions asks about the contemporary relationship between African nations and one-time colonial empires. And I guess a way of thinking about that question is, in a sense, in the post-colonial world, have Europe and Africa moved farther apart than they once were? Or in fact, you see that as a kind of continuity across that?
Yes, it's a story actually teaching class. And as I learn, as I go through archives, I'm seeing that, the decolonization never took place. we are still very much in a continuity that has taken a different shape, different forms. I was reading recently a book about the currency used in Francophone Africa, which is completely related to the French francs that doesn't even exist anymore. You know, there are continuities that are really embedded into economics, tied into subjugation. So the subjugation continues, but it has it works at different levels, and it's a difficult relationship. But like every difficult relationship, there are pockets of resistance, and there are pockets of hope, and there are cross collaborations that we should never forget, because there's always a bigger story than the narrative of pain, dissolution, and all the rest of it. And you know, that story too is like that as well. One day perhaps I'll tell it. It's too complicated, but yes.
I'm going to wrap this up. I have one more short question for you, but I again want to thank you for this book, and urge folks to themselves take time to not only go out and get it, but to really, I think, have our eyes opened to, as you say, both the extraordinary distinctness of this relationship between Europe and Africa, and the many peoples, right, who animate those worlds. But for me as a reader, and I think it will be true for others, it has great resonances with what we might know more about, and what we might think of as US history turns out to be part, I think, and connected to this world that you've drawn for us. In my last minute, I'm going to ask you, if I could, just to tell us what you're working on, because you've been on social media to a next book, and
Yes.
so I have the moderator's prerogative before I thank everybody, ask if you wouldn't give us a preview of what you're up to.
Oh, I'm very excited about this one. So I'm working on Gateway to Empire, which is about 15 ports related to enslavement that made the world. So these are not necessarily the ports that you think they are, but these are ports across centuries that engage in a dialogue between themselves. And that dialogue was related to the history of enslavement. However, there was much more going on there. As usual, you have different layers: gender, identity, ordinary people, sailors, enslaved. And I can't wait to be able to write it. Yes.
Well, I'm excited for it, and I am not in any way surprised by learning that your work continues to be as important and as ambitious as this book. And so we thank you very much. I have the honor of thanking you on behalf of the Center for Brooklyn History, and we very much appreciate you making time across time zones, across the ocean and more, to be with us this evening in Brooklyn. We thank everyone for coming out for this conversation, and hope you'll use the links to learn more about the center, but also to buy your own copy of African Europeans. So Professor Otele, it's been an honor to be with you this evening, and we thank you very much.
Professor Jones, thank you so very much. And thank you, everyone.
Be well, everybody.